Well, it's fantastic to be here. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I am quite emotional because I've spoken in many places and there is an eternal problem, which is what do you do with a bottle of water when you have a glass lectern and nowhere to place it? And finally, there is a solution, and I cannot believe that anyone had not thought of this before, but I'm going to start marketing this in Australia. I don't know if there is a patent in this country, but this is just absolutely wonderful. So yes, but that's not why we're here. What I wanted to do is just begin with some remarks. We'll dig into some more things. But I just wanted to bring one idea from my book. And it's always interesting at something like this. You've got people who have read your book and want to hear something else. And you've got people who haven't read your book and want to hear from your book. So I'm going to attempt to chart a middle path between these two things, which is talking about something from my book, but then also adding some other comments and perhaps looking at it in a fresh way. But I wanted to begin with talking about a concept which I feel captures where we are. And it's one of the key ideas of the book. For a long time, I was trying to capture a word, to come up with a term that would describe what kind of phase we're in. It was very clear, I think from 2016 onwards, that some of the scripts that we expected about the world were not being fulfilled. We were heading in different directions. The world where it looked like it was heading in, say, 2010 was not where we ended up in 2020. We had unexpected electoral results all around the world. We had cultural shifts that moved super quickly. We had technological advancements that we weren't expecting to come. And then, of course, which is a big deal from where I'm from in my city, we had a pandemic, which for us lasted in almost a 2-year lockdown. And emerging from that, I wrote this book in the midst of the pandemic. Have I gone? Right, I'm still here. I wrote this book in the midst of the pandemic. In year one, what happened was Australia's plan was to cut itself off from the rest of the world, go into lockdown, get rid of the virus, and then we could live our lives free until the world gets a vaccine. And this was a brilliantly successful plan everywhere in Australia and New Zealand except Melbourne, where we had an outbreak. So it looked like we were going to get rid of it by the end of 2020. And I said, no way I'm writing a book during a pandemic. So I signed a contract at the end of 2020 when Australia got to COVID zero, not knowing we would go back into a 9-month lockdown. So it was a book written homeschooling and at home, but it was trying to capture this sense that we'd emerged into a new world. And I couldn't grab onto a name that would describe this time. And when I came to the conclusion, the reason I was struggling to capture a name for the phase that we were entering into was that we hadn't entered into a new phase. We actually found ourselves at the end of a phase. We are about to celebrate the coronation. That's not just a thing for your nation. It's also the change of monarch for my nation. My Prime Minister is in London as we speak, as are many other Prime Ministers from different Commonwealth countries. And when we talk about different eras, we talk about an era like the Victorian era, the Edwardian era. And the reason we say this is eras are sort of containers for a time. They capture the mood, the characters, the thoughts, the ideas that shape that time. And eras come to an end. And perhaps where you may have a king or a queen passing and then a new king or queen being coronated, we actually find that it's a bit more blurry in between those times. And what I came to realize was that actually a new era had not begun. We were in what I called a grey zone, a kind of no man's land between two phases. And this is a particularly confusing place to live in because what you have remnants of the passing era. So in some ways you can confuse yourself that the old world is still there. You have elements of the new world appearing. I saw on television just the other day a Boston Robotics walking dog in China interacting with a living dog. Now, this was starting to become a normal thing in parts of China. It's not a normal thing where I live, but there's going to be a point where we're walking around London and there's going to be robotic dogs walking past you. And you probably won't, out of the corner of your eye, register whether it's a real dog or a robotic dog. The next stage it's going to get to is I saw that they're now making drones, military drones, which are actually revivified dead birds. So a bird will die like an eagle, they place a drone inside of it, and it's able to fly over an enemy position, but it actually looks like a real eagle. So there's going to be another stage where there's literally animals walking around and you're like, is that real or is that a robot? So this stuff's not going to happen on one moment. They're not going to announce it. What happens is new phases begin to appear, and before you know it, they're there and they're normal. So we exist in this confusing time, caught between two eras. And what's confusing about these grey zone moments is there are no markers. When you're in an era, it has a feel, it has clear rules, there's clear authorities, there's a moral code, there's a way of understanding the world. But when you're in a grey zone in between time, actually what it means is that there's no markers. It's like what used to be up is now down. And I think there's a sense in the world that as we've come out of the pandemic, you guys came out of it quicker than us, but actually what it feels like is there's something, it feels the same, but then things have changed as well. And what we saw too, as we emerged from the pandemic, it wasn't just about the pandemic. The pandemic was something which seemed to be one of those crises which cascaded into other crises. And we emerged from a pandemic where a lot of money was printed, there was quantitative easing and stimulus in order to get the economy going from one of its biggest shocks since the Great Depression in 1929. Is we then saw the economic effects of rising inflation, a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis, which was then, which was partially also because we saw something unexpected, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And all of a sudden things are changing and the geopolitical landscape is shifting. So the world looks the same, but it looks different. And it's really hard to situate yourself in this place. One movie which is emblematic of something that is happening is the 1978 remake of, I think it was the 1954 film, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I don't know if I should recommend horror movies at a Christian event. It's not super gory from memory. But it takes place in San Francisco. It's a fantastic San Francisco in its sort of prime architecture phase. Really well shot. 1978, Donald Sutherland as the lead. And Donald Sutherland plays the role of a health inspector for the San Francisco municipal government. And what happens is, without him knowing, and if you watch the movie a second time, you can see something happening in the background is people are slowly being infected by an alien sort of bacteria, which is actually turning them into these zombie-like creatures. Now, at the beginning, they don't really realize this is going on because they're just living their lives as per normal. But slowly through the movie begins and no one's become what they call the pod people in the movie, who have this very distinctive screech. All the pod people are connected to each other. They all think the same. And so at the beginning of the movie, no one's really become a pod person. But if you don't realize it, and you can watch the movie back and you get when it's happening, is slowly there's a great sort of change in the population of San Francisco, where by the end of the movie, everyone bar one woman is a pod person. And I won't give the spoiler away, I'll let you watch it. But I did say only one person is left, and she's a woman. So what happens to Donald Sutherland? I'm not going to tell you. I did hint heavily there. But there's this middle bit where Donald Sutherland has this sense that people are changing. He has this sense that the way people interact with him, the pod people are emotionless. They seem to be connected to each other. They seem to move like a hive in a really strange way. And so he's trying to get to the bottom of this mystery. And as I watched this movie, it reminded me of something that I'd read by an American pastoral care academic called Bruce Vaughan Rogers. I think he's at Yale. And he wrote a book and he made this comment. He'd been pastorally caring for people for decades. He lists in the book, he's lost 55,000 pastoral care meetings with people or something or other. But he made this point, he said, something changed 30 years ago. The kind of person that I began to meet changed 30 years ago. And this trend had increased to the point where human beings had changed, a little bit like the pod people taking over San Francisco. And what he found was the average person that came to him was someone who was very anxious. They were worried about their life. All of a sudden, the sort of rugged individualism that had characterized America was disappearing. That actually a new kind of individualism was emerging, but it was one where people would struggle with things like imposter syndrome. They were very aware what other people were thinking. There was this sense they had that there was almost a doom that at some point they would get found out and this terrible thing would happen to them. And so they were constantly self-doubting, constantly sort of motivated by anxiety, constantly running away from anxiety. And this wasn't just a small subset of people who might suffer from a mental health condition. This was a whole variety of people, except there was another 10% of people, he said. This 10% of people were almost the ragged individualism times 10. They didn't care what other people think. They were entitled, they were pushy, they controlled the other people. And what I think Bruce Rogers Vaughan is saying there is that we've actually lived through a kind of change of what it is to be human. I think part of this is also that if you look back at the last 30 years, there's been a particular model of what it is to be a human being in the West. We've lived through this time where there was an ideology in the world that the world would slowly slide to this kind of utopia, that we would have endless economic growth that Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Fed, promised. We were promised that wars would disappear, that we could have just small interventions. Technology would increase our ability to have this smooth world. So this is what's formed anyone who has lived through the last 30 years, particularly if you're under 30, or perhaps that's been the age in which you've lived. And so that kind of person then hits this new phase, this grey zone. And this grey zone time where the ideologies and the stories that we're told about the world don't actually work out, finds themselves running into a kind of crisis. Because our map of the world is no longer working. And so the culture goes through a kind of crisis, but I actually think we've moved from a kind of individualism into a kind of crisis individualism. The way that we talk about ourselves, even from 20 years ago, is radically different. Just look back to that period I was watching from afar, the cool Britannia period, where there seemed to be this pride in Britain, a cultural sort of renaissance, the attitude of Oasis or the Spice Girls. That sort of individualism seems to have actually disappeared from the culture in the ways that we talk about ourselves in really as broken, fragile people. That actually we see the world now as more difficult. It's a scarier place. It's not a place where we can sort of paint our story on. There's something that is changing. And then what happens is, I think the anxiety that was already present, that Vaughan Rogers noted, then becomes epidemic. And in the invasion of the body snatchers, there's really something interesting where he discovers what the pod people are doing. And all the pod people seem to be connected to each other in a sort of non-rational way. And what's interesting about anxiety, and again, I want to differentiate between the mental health condition and a kind of broader social anxiety that is infectious, is that this seems to operate almost virally. And there's something natural about that. If I got up now and sprinted out of this room screaming, probably some of you would follow me. If 10 of us all of a sudden, we timed our watches that a certain minute at 8:15, we're just going to run out screaming, most of you would follow. When we get anxious, it cuts past our rational brain. And so to live today, to pursue cultural renewal, to pursue faith, is to do so in a time where there is a deep digital membrane connecting all of us, which feeds on negative emotions. What the architects of our digital world have learnt is actually negative emotions go much faster in the internet and actually make more money because you click more times when you're actually anxious. And a story that will make us anxious, news that will make us anxious, all of this is really what powers. It's almost a power source, power sourcing some of our digital world today. And so this means it's actually really difficult to lead towards cultural renewal. Because to step out now carries a sense of anxiety. What will people think of me? There's the sort of baseline levels of that. But also to pursue change and to do that in a world which is truly anxious is also a really difficult thing, because you're not just pushing towards a future goal, you're actually needing to deal with the sort of ambient anxiety that is in the community or the people that you're leading. And one of the difficult things about anxiety is that often when people are feeling anxious is they want you then to mirror the anxiety. If the culture is anxious about something and you're not mirroring it back to them, that causes a kind of pattern break in what they feel they should be anxious about. So the American psychologist or family therapist, he was a rabbi and also a family therapist, Edward Friedman, proposed a kind of leadership which I think is relevant for us at this moment and in this time in grey zone where there is great anxiety in many places about our future direction. It operates in our social systems, in our culture, in our churches, in our families, in our friendships. He said that leaders are different to what we imagine them to be. We often imagine a leader as someone with a great charisma, a personality, a great communicator, perhaps someone who's tall or good looking or has an incredible resume or educational history behind them or a heritage. He actually said the most effective leaders who actually bring about change and can turn anxious systems positive are people who project what he said was a non-anxious presence. That they actually operated as kind of white blood cells in a system which was unhealthy. But the way that they had to do that was to actually, in a sense, push back on the anxiety and have a sense of distance between themselves and the anxiety that is ambient in a room. Now, let me just tell you, people do not like this. If you're not reactive, our internet is super reactive. Something happens and we are asked to react straight away. In Australia, a couple of days ago, I just saw it on the news here, we have bigger shows, MasterChef, and the lead guy in MasterChef is actually a Scottish guy, passed away. It was a big shock just before the season premiered. And his co-star, who's deeply in mourning, took 48 hours to actually write something on social media. Now, no doubt his co-star, who was his friend, was actually deeply grieving, but the Australian public wanted to see him acknowledge this on social media. So this social media furor began, like, when's this guy going to say something? Were they fighting? What was going on? Well, it's absolutely ridiculous. But that's actually what the sort of digital membrane, pod people brain wants at the moment. We want an instant reaction straight away. That's not thinking, it's emotional. Because if someone's not feeding back your anxiety, it almost says, hang on, is there something wrong? Do we need to think about this in a different way? So what Friedman says is we need this kind of differentiation, where we learn to differentiate ourselves. At the end of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, one of the things that the few remaining humans have to do is, in a sense, keep distance from the pod people so as not to get infected. Now that goes contrary to what we think about leadership. Leaders are close, they're shaking hands, they know everyone's name. So it's not actually a physical presence distance. What it actually, though, is a kind of emotional distance. Not for a sense of not caring. One can care without reflecting back anxiety. If in a room, everyone got up, and I did my little trick, and 10 of us ran out, but then someone up the back here, who was not a leader at this event, stood up and said, guys, it's just a joke, not a problem. Everyone calmly sit back down. At that point, in a sense, they become the leader because they're acting in a non-anxious way. So I pushed into Friedman and I began to apply his ideas in my life and my ministry. But I got to this point where I realized that it is not possible in my strength to be a non-anxious presence. Friedman must have had incredible fortitude to, in the face of incredible pushback, to pursue a non-anxious presence. When I was 30, I was diagnosed with bipolarity. And so the reality of mental health for me is an ever-present reality. How do I preach this message when actually mental health is a big part of my life and I have to manage it every day? I live healthily now, but it's always there. I have to be careful. There's a constant sense of anxiety that I can push into. So stepping into a non-anxious presence is something that I began to realize is a fantastic theory, but utterly impossible for, I think, 99.9% reoccurring humans, and the 0.1 is a pod person, who is able to, in their own strength, continually in the face of anxiety, just stay completely calm the whole time. And what I realized is that I need to reframe this theory biblically. That if I look at who humans are, who we're called to be, our Genesis identity was actually called to be people who lived in the presence of God. In fact, the vision in the New Testament of a human being is a kind of what Tim Mackey, a friend, part of the Bible Project, calls mini temples. You're a mini temple. The temple wasn't rebuilt in Jerusalem after it was destroyed by Vespasian and the Romans in 70 AD. The reason is, when Christ died on the cross, the curtain was torn from top to bottom. The presence has now gone out into the world and it dwells in you and I. So the new way of leadership is being non-anxious, but really that's my way of getting you to start to think about presence-driven leadership. where the Holy Spirit is present in every moment. And I think that's the calling that humans have. And I think that's the posture which cuts across any kind of vocation that you have. And it's something, I don't have all the answers of how to do that myself, but I think it's something we need to, together as the church, work as a project. Because as the world gets more anxious, it needs more of the presence of God, and people are going to be more hungry for the presence of God. That's my opening remarks.
Mark, that was outstanding. Thank you. There are so many places where we could go with this conversation, but let me first remind you all that do log your questions. It's great to see them coming through. You can like other people's questions, just use the QR code there, and we'll come to some of those in a moment. Mark, I thought where we could start is with the Pope. So the Pope said, "We're not living in an era of change, but a change of era." And as you were talking, I sensed that you would probably agree to an extent.
Well, I think the operative word there I focus on is change. So there's got to be a change process. If you change a role, there's often a handover. And there's often, the person who was in the previous role might work alongside of you to sort of get you up to speed on the job. So I think that, I think it makes sense that it's not going to be like, look, what will the kingship of King Charles look like? It's going to look different to Elizabeth's reign, but we're not going to know what that looks like in 4 days' time. I think in 10 years' time, we'll look back and reflect on what that meant, and there'll be a period of change. So I think this is like the layover. I flew 16 hours to Dubai, and then there's a layover where I get on another plane. I think we're in that layover period in between. So yes, we're in a change of eras, but we're in the change process. That's why it's so confusing.
And if we were to step back a little bit from this cultural moment and think about the whole history of the world, the question I have is the extent to which the level of anxiety within our culture is qualitatively different. In other words, is this grey zone really that different from other grey zones that have occurred in history? For example, in the first century, presumably if you were living in Jerusalem in the first century, you were deeply anxious for a whole set of different reasons to do with who was in power, what they might do to you. And a similar thing would have applied here during the Second World War or during the height of the concern around nuclear war in the 1960s. So what, if anything, is qualitatively different, would you say, about this moment?
I think it's Malcolm Gladwell who talks about the Blitz and the fact that when it ended, there were people who missed it because there was a sense of communality. People went into shelters together. There was a great working together. And I think what's different about this is particularly the technological reality that we're connected digitally. And you didn't have that. You were able to be alone more in the past and get a sense of distance, or be with your family, or be with the people you choose to be. The speed of news, you think about the fact that you could read the newspaper. You read C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, I think it is, and he's talking about, almost having the demon is like encouraging his patient to think about the war heaps, but he's actually, so there's a sense you could even have a distance from the war, And but I think in our time, what is unique is that we're connected globally, and we're connected in a sort of form of technology that is very much built upon, in a sense, I would say, farming our negative emotions. I think that's something really key. Plus, I think it's also at the end of a particular kind of period, which pushed into a kind of individualism, which I think is beginning to fall over now. But I think you're right. You look at, the people going out to John in the wilderness, they're anxious for the Messiah to come, for what's happening. So I think you're right. There's grey zone times, are periods of great anxiety, but there's some unique features to ours.
And in terms of antidotes to that, one of the things that you touched on, but you talk a lot about in the book, is a reorientation that comes through re-entering the biblical story, and how that can help us to be less anxious, a non-anxious presence. Could you talk a little bit more about that practically? What might that look like? How might we do that?
Yeah. So I think part of the reason we're anxious is the story that gave meaning is falling over, and the structures that were built around that story is falling over. And I think I encourage people to step into the biblical story, and particularly when you read the biblical story, it has a story which has a really unique identity for human beings. We are created in the image of God, but we're created to have this sense of what in the Hebrew is a shomer, to be a guardian of creation. That actually what we're called to do is to take chaos and turn it into a sort of kind of heavenly order, that we're called to bring this heavenly imprint to earth. That's really what Genesis is all about. So I think that there is this call on us that when we see ourselves in a chaotic time, when we feel that internally, that actually there is a biblical call there to step back into our biblical identity, not the continual attempts to reflect an identity to us by the culture. And I think in doing that, we find a sense of purpose. And a key thing, I mean, this goes back to Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, that, when you have a sense of meaning, that is an orientating point. And then I think I'd add to Frankl's thought and say that actually what the scriptures tell us is that heaven provides an imprint for our lives. It's directive. When we see in Genesis, it's both the heavens and the earth created, and the heavens operate as a kind of blueprint for what the world should be. This is why Jesus teaches his followers to pray, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that's also true for our inner world as well.
Yeah, thank you. We've got an opportunity we've got a little focus group here, so there are, 250 odd people, not odd people, unique people here this evening. I'd be interested to know, if you were to think about your life now and your view of the world today and compare that with 10 years ago, if you are more anxious about the world today than you were 10 years ago, would you raise your hand? This is a safe place. And if you are less anxious about the world today than you were 10 years ago, and if really there's no change. So overwhelmingly, people seem in this focus group, which clearly isn't scientific, but seem more anxious about the world today, which proves the point that this level of anxiety is seeping into the church. It's not simply a cultural phenomenon, and of course the church is located within the culture. So I wonder if you'd comment about that on that. This is one of the questions that is raised, is the way that deconstruction is making its way through the Western church, and how might the church need to learn to do better as it engages with a new generation?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think deconstruction is creeping into the Western church. I think every generation has a stream of deconstruction, and I think it's probably algorithmically, if you feel deconstruction's everywhere, it's probably an algorithmic thing as well in terms of what you're clicking on online. I think Melbourne in the late 90s and early 2000s went through a proper deconstruction period where most of the people I know deconstructed their faith, which I don't see it at the level it is now. But I think certain things get boosted. I would say that probably what's happened is the deconstruction thing is because American evangelical church has gone through a great cultural crisis over its identity, and because of America's power in the world, that's sort of boosted through the technological networks. But I think, that comes back to a church which is helping people to ask these big questions and work through these questions. And the other thing I would say is that there's a lot of talk about deconstruction in the church, but I think what a lot of people are missing is the amount of deconstruction in the society of actually what is going on in the world. It's a much more hushed. It's easier. I know it's not easy to people who would say, I'm deconstructing the church. It's not easy. I actually think it's harder to deconstruct in the culture. I have whispered conversations with people who talk to me about stuff that they shouldn't be thinking about in the culture, who feel like they're betraying their family or themselves of what they're thinking. So I think we're in a time where there's again, if you're coming out of an era and going into an era, there's going to be a lot of deconstructing of the previous era. So there's a mood of deconstruction at the moment. I mean, just to give you an example, if you look at something like the Arab Spring, which really sort of kicked off, began in Tunisia, but really the Egyptian side of that was a computer engineer in the UAE who, through his understanding of computers, was able to sort of really bring down the Mubarak regime. But then it was really difficult to rebuild after that. And the Muslim Brotherhood came in and sort of took power. So what that says is the tools of our age are able to pull things down, but it's a lot harder to actually build things up. So I think we're in a time of deconstruction. That's a cultural mood.
And to what extent do you think that cultural mood and level of anxiety is limited to the West? Is it a Western phenomenon or a global one? If it's a Western phenomenon, can the East help us?
It's really interesting. I think talking to people in sort of Europe and America. I think it's probably hard for people to grasp this, but if you are in Tokyo or if you're in Seoul, if you're in Shanghai, and you look at a Western city, it looks very backward and very run down now. And there's a lot of, like the movie Her, when it wanted to shoot a future Los Angeles, actually shot it in Shanghai. The TV series Westworld, when it wanted to feature a future Los Angeles, I think it was, it shot it in Seoul. So actually a lot of the research coming out of Asia is that there's tremendous optimism amongst Asian young people. And probably where I live, in a country which is a hinge country between the West, we definitely see that. It's the Pacific century. And in a sense, some of the crisis that's happening is actually really happening in the Anglo-American world and perhaps Europe more than it's happening in places like Asia.
One of the areas that is causing anxiety is around questions of identity, either because we are asking questions about our own identity and are anxious about that, or we're concerned about a wider trend around identity. What am I? How do I define myself? What advice would you give for us as the church in dealing with that?
Well, and I think definitely the economic order that really sort of emerged in that 30-year ago period. If you look at the economic era, it was one which spawned, what some people call a second individualism or a radical individualism. And part of that too was that there's a realization that you moved beyond just getting people to buy goods and services, and there was an increasing consumer market to help people define who they were. And I studied advertising, and we learnt how to, issues around products, which gave people a sense of identity. And I think we've had 30 years of that increasing and increasing. So I think that, we have to acknowledge that, again, we've lived in an economic order which has exploited people and undermined their sense of identity in order to profit off them. So for me, I wonder if it's a justice issue that we don't look at from the right angle.
Something else that's affected us profoundly, you've referenced it, is the pandemic, the global pandemic. And that shook everything up in terms of the way we understood ourselves as church and the way the church did church, both gathered and scattered. But in lots of ways, it would appear that certainly gathered church has tended to try and get back to what we had before. Is that a good idea or not? Should we be doing things differently from the way that we were to respond to the new situation?
What I've noticed with the pandemic, it was a global reality, but then I think how governments dealt with it was very different where you were. I was just in London and talking to some Malaysian friends, and we had so many notes to compare because Australia reacted more like an Asian country than it did a Western country. So for us, after a very long lockdown, it was interesting. Again, Kuala Lumpur was almost in a similar lockdown to Melbourne. We found, at the beginning, our online service had massive engagement. By the end, after 2 years, no one wanted to watch screens. They'd spent 2 years sitting in front of screens, and we saw a real hunger to come back in person. So for us, the gathering part in Melbourne, the state government's putting all this money because there's a sense that people want to gather again. So I think that's dependent on your context. I think it opened up opportunities, but I think, again, that's a question which really is, what's your city? What's the people you're doing ministry with? I wouldn't want to give hard and fast answers, but I do think it has undermined some sense of platform-driven, event-based Christianity. That's what I'm noticing across the board. And I think people are coming out, and I think we did lose across the world a number of people who perhaps were coming, for dare ever want a better word, as cultural Christians who have now left. And I think there has been a refining process. And I think we've all been through that. And I think there's a sense that the church is emerging is less focused on, perhaps some of the techniques that it attempted to push into in the last season.
Interesting. So I recognise that I'm living in a grey zone. I am anxious about the state of the world. But I want to be a non-anxious presence in the world, and I want to engage in social, cultural, spiritual renewal. How? What other practices, perhaps some of the spiritual disciplines that I might undertake that will form me inform others that will help to do this?
What I realised is there's a temptation coming out of the period that we've just been in where, because so much has been out of control, and there's an increasing sense that in the world things are out of control, that I think if we just begin with practices, we can go wrong. And in a sense, what we can get to the point is realising that we can't control the world. So we try and create a smorgasbord of different practices. Some could be things like, the perfect exercise routine, the perfect nutrition, the perfect balance of our calendar. And I think we can even do that with what are actually quite good, healthy Christian practices. But I think what I've found is I've known people who have really pushed into practices for years, even years before the pandemic, who got to the pandemic and found they couldn't do those practices. And actually, I think that the beginning point, I'm a big believer in the saying that personal renewal leads to corporate change. And I think the starting point for me was this sense that I can't do this. I almost had to realize that all the things that God was calling me to do in the roles, I simply can't do this. I can't do it in my own strength. And I think what I really want to just really reiterate is if anyone experiences anxiety, and I deliberately was vulnerable in sharing my story, is that this is not to shame anyone who feels anxiety. It's actually to bring hope that anxiety doesn't have to define you. And I think what I found is that instead of a practice, I found a presence of God. And I think when you first encounter the presence of God in your weakness and you're collapsing in front of him, I think that that's then the place to build out practices from there. But I think sometimes we can get that wrong.
And so in my everyday life and work, on a Monday morning, how might I encounter the presence of God?
I think this is where, Brother Lawrence's wonderful little book, Practice in the Presence of God, who was someone who never wanted to write a book. He washed dishes. I absolutely love that he was a dishwasher as a model. It's absolutely brilliant. And he practiced the presence of God as he washed dishes. And I think what it has done for me is a discipline, a posture where you're constantly reminding yourself you're in the presence of God. That language I used of Tim Mackey of a mini temple. Even I had half a day off here and I was walking around the city and I just, was zoning out my brain. But I try and remember myself, I have the presence in me. What does that mean how I interact with people differently? How does that mean how I see myself? Continually returning to the fact that Jesus is with us, that his Holy Spirit is in us. I think it's almost a repeated thing that we almost need to spend so much time reframing. I mean, this guy, think how much we touch it and caress it, and it all gets a bit creepy, really. And it influences us. I feel like our disciplines around the presence need to be, almost more than that, if that makes sense. As much of a reality of touching that, of touching his presence, he's with us.
Let's talk about that little black box for a minute. In your book, you write that our digital network acts like a super spreading agent of anxiety within the already existing relational and social networks. And then one of the questions that we've had this evening is focused on Gen Z. How do we encourage younger leaders to be presence-driven in an age of distraction? They're slightly different questions, but possibly related. What would you say about that? What should our relationship be to that, to the world that opens up? And to what extent is that a help or hindrance in our efforts to be a non-anxious presence?
I got to spend some time and had dinner with some of the guys who've been part of the Asbury outpouring. And also know some Gen Zs in my own church who've had similar experiences. And what I'm seeing and hearing from people like that is actually, I think what Gen Z are wanting is actually something radically different than what the culture's giving them. I think we can fall into this trap that because the culture has shaped people in that particular way, that therefore we need to then fit the gospel into that way. I think Gen Z is desperately looking for an alternative. It's interesting, I said to my daughter who's Gen Z, I said, what's the difference? I said, I'm getting this picture that you guys don't like millennials. What's the difference between you and millennials? And she said, Dad, millennials thought that they were going to be superstars and that the world was their oyster. We're just hoping that the world's not over by the time we're 30. and I was like, well, okay, wow, all right. And what I realized is they're desperately looking for an answer. I have the image of we had a time where we've been pressing into just God, seeking His presence, and there's one image, I heard the story afterwards of a girl who's a Gen Z, and we really felt this tangible sense of the Holy Spirit. We finished a particular time that we had, we're going to end it, and then we just felt the Holy Spirit there, His presence, not in a loud way, it's an incredibly beautiful, gentle way. And so we just sat there, and we sat there for hours, like till 5 o'clock at night, from about 5 till 10 at night. And my favourite story was a Gen Z girl who was texting her dad, "Dad, don't come yet. Give me another 20 minutes. The presence of God is here." That's new for her. I think what I notice about this country is there's a lot of people who, there's memories of God moving at different times, and there's been recent times. But I think there's a new generation who, that's a story they've heard. They've never experienced it. One of the things that really hit me talking to the Asbury guys, they said, Gen Z have been characterised as a generation who will have moral ambiguity. And they said, we're actually hungry for moral clarity. And so I actually wonder whether Gen Z's actually going to just zig in a time when everyone else is zagging. Not everyone. Again, I think we've got to be really clear. We talk about generations and we think the whole generation's going to do it. I'm a Gen Xer, and so many of my generation in Melbourne deconstructed. And there's a small group of us who kept on, and we sort of look at each other like at the end of the Lord of the Rings, where the hobbits are looking at each other like because we've been through something. And but I love also seeing a Gen X woman in my church who's been through similar stuff and been through some really difficult stuff, being touched by the presence of God. So it's never a whole generation; it's always a remnant in a generation. So I think we've got to move from trying to make it happen for everyone to instead creating remnants. And I think remnants are like foundations or base camps out of which renewals happen.
You're a man of letters. You've written numerous books, and in your books you reference numerous books. And the question that we've got is, what are the 3 books that have influenced you most, and why?
Harry Potter? No. I get this question often, and I don't think I can pick because I just read so many different things. I do come back to Dallas Willard's Divine Conspiracy. I remember reading, again, just to let people know, I have high school. I don't have a degree. I found high school very difficult, and my family history, came from. My dad came from a very working class background, and we talked though. We talked all the time. So I think the second thing is I wouldn't say I read heaps, but then I think there was the conversations around the dinner table, and I remember it was that context, and my grandfather was a trade unionist and my uncles electricians and stuff, but the most amazing conversations, they talked about the world. So I'd say the second book is The Conversations. And I think of Martin Lloyd-Jones and his book on revival. I think of John Stott and his book on contemporary Christian issues facing contemporary Christians, or whatever it was. They were really seminal books for me. And I think it's actually quite weird being here because I feel like there's 2 sides that God sort of got me running in, which is the, Lloyd-Jones' hunger for revival and that deep sort of sense of engaging with the scriptures, and Stott, also had that, but also that engagement with society. He's off in Wales writing papers on contemporary issues. It's a real privilege to be here standing in those 2 places. That was like 4 things, but yeah.
No, that is great. Mark, we are so grateful for you. We so appreciate your vulnerability as well as your analytical mind, the way that you're interpreting culture, but also we are excited and infected by your passion for social, cultural, spiritual renewal. Thank you for sharing with us as you have. In a moment, I'm going to ask if you would pray for us. We are seeking to be disciples of Jesus in our time in this place, and we are seeking to be a non-anxious presence in a world and a culture that is often deeply anxious and fragmented. So we would love you to do that for us if you would. But first, friends, would you please show your appreciation to Mark Sayers?